Is Dirshu Mishnah Berurah as we continue Simin Yud Aleph, learning all the various halachas of the strings of the Tzitzis themselves. And today we're going to learn Siv Vav and Siv Zayin. And we begin in the Machaber Siv Vav, in which he discusses an interesting halacha, lots of Cheshem Mishpat ramifications. The halacha is regarding how we have a acquisition, how do we have a transfer of ownership when an item is stolen. Says the Machaber in Siv Vav, Masan Mitzemer Gazel. If someone makes tzitzis from stolen wool, now let's be careful and hone in on the detail that the Machaber is referring to the tzemer, the wool. So you steal the wool, what's the halacha? Psulim, the tzitzis are basal. Why? It says you should make it for yourselves from their own. So says the Machaber, the halacha is the tzitzis have to be yours. If you steal them, no good. And the Machaber again is talking about stealing the wool itself. Continuing into the Ramah, before we see the Mishnah Berurah, says the Ramah, V'davka shegazal hachutin, and only if you stole the chutin, the string. Avolim gazal tzemer v'asan chutin, but if you stole the tzemer, and then you made from it the chutin, which the halacha would be ksherim. And of course, this is very difficult to read, as everyone realizes, I don't understand. We just pointed out the Machaber says you stole the tzemer. Says the Ramah, only if you stole the chutin, the strings. But if you stole the tzemer, then you created the strings, it's kosher. So what the Ramah himself is referring to is clear. The conversation between the Machaber and the Ramah is a bit vague, and we'll see in the Mishnah Berurah that this was a large point of discussion in the Magen Avram, etc. Says the Ramah, continuing, Miu lechatchila Asr la'asayson. You're not allowed to do this. Ulinyan bracha in the Kavan Reish Simin Tav Reish Mem Tes. Let's just see Siv Zayin for the contrast. So Siv Vav was stolen tzitzis. Siv Zayin is chutin shu'ulin, borrowed tzitzis halvahi. Is a halva, and of course there's two ways of borrowing something. There is a she'ila and then there is halva. She'ila is you borrow the item to use the item and return the item. Halva is you borrow the item to use the item up and then you're going to return the cash. So says the Machaber, borrowing strings is a form of halva that you're allowed to use up the item. Because you don't return it in the form that you borrowed it, you put it on your tzitzis, and therefore it's as if it's your own. So we'll get to that in a moment. So Sivav is stolen strings, stolen wool made into strings. Siv Zayin is borrowed strings. Then we begin right now the Mishnah Berurah Siv Katan. Mishnah Berurah Siv Katan Chav Zayin, in which the Mishnah Berurah points out that the Gzeres HaKasav of Asu Lahem, Mishel Lahem, says the Mishnah Berurah Nira Pash. The following is obvious. And this perhaps is a more common application. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the same halacha is if you bought the tzitzis on credit, and the seller, oil, as we turn over the Mishnah Berurah, he continues and he says, oil v'nafik azuzi. And the seller is what? He's chasing you down. And he's demanding you pay for it. V'zeh, and the borrower ain't a right to l'shalim loy. You don't want to pay him. So you bought on credit, you plan on eventually paying, but right now the seller is claiming, I want the cash now. And you're saying, I don't have the cash right now. In such a scenario, says the Mishnah Berurah, because the seller is showing that even though I sold it to you on credit, I really want the cash right now, he's showing you that indeed I didn't really give it to you. I only gave it to you on the condition that you would give me the cash. It's not yours. In such a scenario. And continues Mishnah Berurah, in which the Ramah says, V'davka, this is only if you stole the wool and you stole the strings. But if you stole the wool and you made the strings, it's better. Va'az, says Mishnah Berurah, why is it better if you stole the wool and created the strings? Va'az, afilu nisyai yeshua bailim pas. If you stole the strings and you just take the strings and you want to put them on your beged, even if there's yiyosh, of course the yiyosh is when the owner gives up hope of ever getting it back. even if the owner is miyayish, it's still possible. Why? A very fundamental halacha. Many of us probably remember this from the Bava Metzia days. The yiyush lo ikana. Yiyush, the fact that the owner feels and says, I'm never going to get back my item, that does not effect an acquisition. And says Mishmur, let's say you did a minor change. The strings weren't intertwined as we spoke about in the previous days. They're individual strands, and you twined them together. And you took the 6 to 8 strings, the individual strands, and you made them into one string. So maybe you would think that's a maisa. You changed the item, and that's an acquisition. Says Mishmur, that is not called a shinoi. Why? So the shanu shmama in the name of the item does not change. It's the same strand, it's the same chutin, and therefore that itself is not enough. Which of course we're seeing from these words that Pri Megadim quoted by the Mishnah Berurah, that if the name would change, which is the reason of the Ramah said that if you steal raw wool and you take the raw wool and you make it into strings, then the Ramah said that is good. Why is that good? Because then it's going from tzemer into strands. Then it is a shinoi hashem. Then that is a kinyan and acquisition. And then you would be yotze the mitzvah. Of course, we're seeing that you're not allowed to do this. Sorry for the noise. Of course, we saw you're not allowed to do this, the Ramah said, but that would be the kinyan. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkat Chates, Shegazla Achutin, you stole the strings. Ayin Magen Avram, Sivkatin Yos. And this is the Magen Avram in which he points out the discrepancy in the conversation between the Machaber and the Ramah. Of course, the Ramah was a safer rain for Ba'ai. Ramosha Isserlis as a commentary on the Machaber, just by point of on the side for a quick few seconds, the Ramah was about to put out a sefer on like the Shulchan Aruch, but Rabbi Yosef Kai beat him to it. So the Ramah adapted his entire sefer, what incredible chachma, as a hagah, as a gloss, as a comment on the Machaber, changing and arguing in every detail in which he felt the Machaber was wrong. So here the Ramah says to the Machaber, it's only the strings, but the wool's okay. And of course the problem is, as we pointed out, what the Machaber was talking about wool. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkat Chates, look at the Magen Avram, Sivkat Yod, U'Dvarav Hagazu Chaylik al Machaber. The Magen Avram learns that the Ramah is arguing on the Machaber, which of course, it sounds like he's arguing the problem is in that the Machaber said Semer. So if you go strictly in the words of the Machaber, it would sound like the Machaber and the Ramah are agreeing in that if you stole, incorrect. That from the words themselves, you see that the Machaber is not agreeing in the fact that the Machaber said raw wool is possible, and the Ramah says raw wool is going to be okay. The Machaber held that even if you made it from raw wool and you changed it, the Machaber still said it's a problem because it has to be yours, and it's not yours from the fact that it's stolen. And on that detail is where the Ramah is arguing and saying no. The Ramah is arguing and saying if you stole the raw wool and you created it into strings, then you are koineh. But of course, this is a large discussion. As we pointed out, this is the opinion of the Magen Avraham. Continues the Mishnah Berurah Sivkat Lamed. So if you stole the raw wool and you made it into strings, it's kashirim. Not only did you change it from raw wool into strings, but however there is as well yiyush that the owner gave up hope. Vekanya biyush. Vishini Hashem. There's two things that are happening, says the Taz. Number one, there's Yish, the owner gives up hope. And number two, there's Shini Hashem, the change of name of item from wool to string. To make Kara Tzemer, V'hashta Chutin, originally it's Tzemer, now it's string. Avol Magen Avraham Kosav. No. The Ramah did not say what you Taz just says the Magen Avraham. The wording of the Ramah holds in that when is it kosher? Even before Yish. The Ramah doesn't mention Yish. The change itself is enough to affect that acquisition. And that is the machlokes between the Taz and the Magen Avram. And as we pointed out many times, the words of the Mishnah Berurah, he says, Avol Magen Avram, which would hone in that that's the psak of the Mishnah Berurah, and the fact that the Mishnah Berurah is being lenient, is being mekel, in that you could be koine even without Yiyush. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Vim Gazal Chutin Umachal Na'achal of Yiyush. Let's say you stole the strings, and then you sold it to someone else before Yiyush. Lo Yatza Sheni, but the second one's not Yotzei. This Sheni Rishosh below Yiyush. That's not going to be enough. So even though the Mishnah Berurah is lenient, that if you change the item, but that does not help if you just change Rishos, Shini Rishos. Changing Rishos will only work if there's Yish as well. Let's say there's Yish after the fact. It's not simple. Then let's say the owner gave up hope. Then the guy who stole it sold it to someone else. Is that Tzitzis he is kind of because you have Yush and Shini Rishos. In which the Ramah actually pointed you out to go look over there. Says Mishnah Berurah, it's mashma over there. The Yuchal Levarich Vazevin b'Mishnah Mitzvah Ba'Aveira. It's not a Brahma Mitzvah Ba'Aveira. Why? Kivin Shehu Lo Gazel. Again, we're talking about the third party. You did not steal it. You bought it from someone who sold it v'chei basik machzah shekel. That you can make a bracha. Ochein apri megadim sham b'sheim halavosh machmir b'zevik amatasim and chafei v'agra sham machmirim. So it's not a simple detail whether you can even make a bracha. Says Mishnah Berurah Sivkatan Lamed Aleph La'aseisan. It's usher to make this. Rotzalaimer lahat la'titzis elu b'bigdai. You stole the raw wool. You created it into tzitzis. So the Ramah said it's kosher. But says the Ramah to usher to go and put those on a baguette. Why? Because it's a mitzvah ba'aveira. Of course, if you did it, it might be different, but it's forbidden to put it on b'ayin bir halach. Same difference. That's possibly Shandi Nachal Varchlav. You cannot make a bracha Ein Shar Tshuva Bir Halacha. And of course, here the Mishnah Berurah is just quoting the opinion, even though you previously said it's a machlokes. Here the Mishnah Berurah just points out the din that it's going to be that you cannot make a bracha. It says Mishnah Berurah Sevkatalam Megimel Chutin Sheulin Barod. And again, let's just remind ourselves what we said. There's two ways of borrowing something. There's she'ilah. When you borrow an item, that's a she'ilah. You borrow the item, you return the item. I borrow your hammer, I return your hammer. Then there's halva. I borrow $100. I'm not returning that same $100. She'ilah halva is meant to spend. I borrowed that $100. I'm going to spend it, and then I'm going to return you a different $100. So says the Machaber, even though you're borrowing an item, which usually is she'ilah, over here you're borrowing the item with the intent to use that item. I'm going to take the strings, I'm going to put them in my tzitzis. So therefore it's considered a halva that you're allowed to use them. Says the Mishnah Berurah Pirush, Koloshin she'ilah mashma she'yachlo eisa davar be'en. As we just explained, she'ilah means you return the item. Avloshin halva, loitzanin, halva is meant to spend. Ve'ilu chutin shulin, and these strings that you borrowed, Mistama ve'alva. Says Mishmur, it's alva, it's meant to be used. Krina be Mishalahem. Uchtidei dami avol, says Mishmurim she'ilam lo yadai t'shechzir lo be'en. Let's say I lent you the strings and I tell you explicitly I want you to return them to me. Lo yivarech alai, you can't make a bracha on them. D'yishlomish hashilu lo melacha acheres. Because I lent you them not for anything else. Avolim heshaloi tzitzis mitukanim kein shalanu. Says Mishmur, let's get a bit practical. Why am I borrowing the tzitzis? I come over to you, I say, do you have any spare tzitzis strings? And you give me them. So they're good. Tzitzis mitukanim kein shalanu shev shezurim ubesukim. They're spun and they're cut. And they're ready to be put on tzitzis. So why did I borrow them? Just to look nice. I borrowed them to put them on my baguette. Then says the Mishnah Berurah, mutter, then you are allowed, as we flip over the page, you could yes make a bracha on it even. Why? Because certainly, why did I borrow it? I borrowed it to use on my talis, my tzitzis. So of course you gave it to me as a matana. On condition I give it back, and therefore I would yes be able to be yet to the mitzvah in such a scenario. And for the last moment or two, let's just quickly look at a few dirshus over here. It says the dirshu, in the case in which you borrowed it and you bought it on credit, and then the owner is pressing you to pay him back, says the dirshu note 41, that it's clear that the moicher does not want to give it to you, and therefore he just wants you to give him money. Sarach HaShulchan says, even in such a case, Excuse me, but the opposite. But it says the Dirshu, let's say it's clear, he's pressing you for the cash, but he doesn't want you to return the tzitzis, he just wants the cash. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, in that case you can make a bracha on it, because it just means he's pressing you for the money, but he didn't let you have the item and you made a kinyan on it. Continues the Dirshu over here, that in note 40, note 43 discusses Gzela of a Lulav. That's the makar of making the bracha over here. Let's say you have Yush afterwards. Let's just look at note 44. I'm time sensitive. We're right for a Pesach right now. Let's say someone stole matzah and then the owner was Nisyayish and he gave it to someone else. On that, in Tov Nandalid, we said the other person is allowed to be Yotzei. He can't even make a bracha. Why? Because it didn't come to your hand be'isser, and then there he doesn't bring the other shita. There he just says it's okay, and perhaps it's a raya that's the ikr sheet of the Mishnah Berurah that you could yes make a bracha on it, and we will pick it up from here, Mirz Hashem, in the next year.